Radio Free Alaska. Welcome to Radio Free Alaska, broadcasting the voice of freedom in an unfree world. Today is the 24th of September, 2024. And today, the title of our program is The Barley Calendar. And I kind of wanted to pick this up because, of course, we had a very spirited debate about the Barley Calendar versus the Zadok Calendar recently here at Sukkot, just yesterday. And so I kind of wanted to pick it up because it's a very interesting thing. The Zadok calendar is very particularized, and they have a series of formulas that they follow to create a calendar that is based upon the vernal equinox. It's exclusively a solar calendar. It's based upon the vernal equinox, and it is factored on a series of 4 groupings of months: 30 days, 30 days, 31, 30, 30, 31, 30, 30, 31, and 30, 30, 31, for a total of 364 days. And then a wait period before you pick up the year again until you arrive at the 4th day of the week, which would be Wednesday. And the reason they arrive at the 4th day of the week is because that was when heaven and earth were created. So they start the calendar on the 4th day, which is a Wednesday. So when this is understood that they pick up the calendar and start the calendar on the Wednesday following the vernal equinox. Now, this is a very interesting proposition because, of course, the question is, what did Mashiach do? Not what would Jesus do, WWJD. What did Yahusha actually do? WDYD. What did Yahusha do? And so one of the things that we see marked out pretty clearly in the gospel, in actually 3 of the gospels, go to the man who owns this particular room and tell him we need the upper room that we might keep the Pesach. And so it is Mashiach saying, we're going to keep the Pesach. We're going to keep the Pesach. Okay, so the Pesach was scheduled at that time in accordance with what the whole of Israel did. Now, we can see evidence of this, that the whole of the kingdom of, Herod's kingdom at that time anyway, the whole of Herod's kingdom was doing a schedule of Pesach, which is called the Day of Preparation, and Matzah, which was the high feast. And so to fully understand this, one has to understand the feast days. So just a little bit of preliminary background on this. Pesach, or Passover, is specified by Leviticus 23 to be the 14th day of the first month. And on the 14th day of the first month, the members of the house of Yasharel were instructed to kill a lamb at evening. Now, the lamb they were to have selected on the 10th day of the month, to keep it in the house with them for 4 days, and to kill the lamb on the evening of the 14th. And then it was to be eaten in haste with unleavened bread, because, of course, Israel would be leaving the following day. And so the departure day, or Passover day, has never been construed as a Shabbat. That is to say, there's no prohibition on working on that day, so that it's known as the day of preparation. And the day of preparation would be workable on up until you got to the even that night, when the high feast of matzah would begin. And typically in the Jewish tradition, the Seder is not held on Passover, but rather is held, or not held on the Arab Passover the evening before, but rather in the afternoon or the day of Passover, coming into matzah. That is incorrect from a scriptural point of view. The scripture says it's to begin at even, the night before, the evening before. Well, we can see that Mashiach was carefully protecting and keeping the Passover. And the Last Supper was, in fact, a correct Passover meal. So, with this being said, then, we can see that when you see, for instance, Joseph Arimathea coming to Pilate and saying, I want to get the body, because we have to take the body off the cross before we reach the Sabbath. Well, this wasn't a Saturday Sabbath. This was the Chag Sameach, the high Sabbath of the first day of Matzah. And it is important for us to understand these things because, of course, the feasts that are set forth in Scripture belong to us in the faith of Mashiach. Because these are the feasts. If Mashiach didn't think that feasts were important, he wouldn't have met his fate on Passover. So that's kind of an important point. And in addition to that, we see that the church begins with earnest on Shavuot, which is Pentecost, another feast day. And it's my contention that Mashiach himself was born on the first day of Tabernacles in the fall feast. So the spring feast, including the Passover matzah, and of course the wave offering or first fruit, is an extremely important book, extremely important feast. Shavuot is the middle feast, extremely important. And the fall feast are represented primarily by the tabernacles, although you have Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. Now, it's interesting because when Joseph of Arimathea came, when the evening had come, there was a rich man of Ramah named Yosef, who also himself was Yahusha's Talmid. And he went to Pilate and begged the body of Yahusha. Then Pilate commanded that the body to be delivered. And when Yosef had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which had been hewn out of the rock, and rolled a great stone door to the sepulchre and departed. Okay, so that is in Matthew 27. But this is not the only recording of this particular event. We can see that, let me see if I can find this here. We can see in other Gospels there is also discussion of this. And anyway, the point being, here it is in Mark chapter 15, Yosef of Ramah and Yosef Arimathea, an honorable counselor in Roman, that was Nobilius Decuriate, but this is an indication that Yosef Arimathea was actually in the Sanhedrin, who also waited for the kingdom of Elohim, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Yahusha. And Pilate marveled as if he were already dead, calling unto him the centurion, and he asked him whether he had been any while dead. And when he knew of it, of the centurion, he gave the body to Yosef. And he brought fine linen, and wrapped him in the linen, and laid him in the sepulchre, which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone to the door of the sepulchre. Okay. And under these circumstances, let me see one last shot. I'm going to see if I got it here where we can see an explanation of this. Let's see. In Luke chapter 23, and behold, there was a man named Joseph, a counselor, and he was a good man and just. The same had not consented to the counsel and the deed of them, and he was Arimathea, and who also had waited for the kingdom of Elohim. This man went unto Pilate and begged the body of Yahusha, and took it down and wrapped it in linen and laid it in the sepulchre. And that day, this is what it says here in Luke chapter 23, verse 54. And that day was the preparation, and the Shabbat drew on. So the day of the crucifixion was the preparation, and the Shabbat drew on. Now, what this tells you is that the Messiah was keeping the feast the night before, properly in accordance with the Torah, on the exact same feast schedule as was the Yahudim at that time in Jerusalem. Same schedule. They were keeping the same schedule. Now, what's interesting about this is that there is a letter from Pontius Pilate, and in this letter, this is a letter from Pilate to the Roman Senate, and he's detailing what had taken place during the crucifixion. And in that description, in that letter, he indicates that Mashiach was crucified in the month of March. Now, that's quite interesting that he was crucified in the month of March, because with this being done, if he was crucified in the month of March, and this is Pilate's record of this, and this is a fairly widely accepted letter, by the way, if he was crucified in the month of March, this tells you something which immediately lets you know that Mashiach, in his keeping of the Passover, was not on the Zadok calendar. It's absolutely dispositive, and here's why. The equinox, the vernal equinox, appears either in March 20th or 21st. So the Zadok calendar would not begin until the Wednesday that followed the vernal equinox. So let's say it was the very next day, at the earliest. It was not the 21st, but the 22nd of March. If it was the 22nd of March, then you have 8 days remaining in March. And if you're counting from this is the first day of the month of Aviv, or the month of Nisan, then you would have to count 14 days from there to reach the Passover date. So at no point could you have Passover under the Zadok calendar any earlier than April 5th, ever. Okay, under the Zadok calendar, you cannot have the Passover any earlier than April 5th, ever. Now, when you see that Mashiach was crucified in March, according to the Archko volume, well, that's very interesting, because that is an indication that the Passover must have been scheduled on a different calendar, most likely the solely lunar calendar, and that when this schedule, it appears to give evidence to the fact that the month began on the new moon which preceded the vernal equinox, with the full moon following the vernal equinox. Now, if you accept that as the case, it's very easy to calculate the death of Mashiach. It happened on March 27th in the year 31 AD. And that would have been some 6 days after the vernal equinox. So you can see that the month would have started before the vernal equinox on the new moon, and with the full moon following the vernal equinox, not appearing until March 28th in the year 31 AD. So the record then is completely consistent with what Pilate's testimony is, because in Pilate's testimony, he says that Mashiach died in the month of March, according to the Archcode volume. Now, so not only does it appear to the fact that Mashiach is recognizing the Barley calendar and not recognizing the Zadok calendar. In other words, he didn't say, forget these guys and their Passover. We're going to have the Passover on April 5th, or we're going to have the Passover on April 10th. Not that there was an April at the time, but we're going to have it at another date. And instead of him saying that, instead we have him keeping the Passover of that time. And that was a Passover fixed on the solely lunar calendar, or the Barley calendar. So the point I'm making in all of this is that with Mashiach's keeping the Passover, which he indicated to his Talmudim, you shall keep this Passover. We shall keep this Passover. When he indicated that, he made a very large conclusion. And the large conclusion was that this was a proper time to keep the Pesach. He kept it not in accordance with the Jews who would keep it the next day, but an Arab Pesach. All right. This tends to give you an idea, and it should give you an idea, that the Zadok calendar was completely inconsistent with the calendar that the Mashiach was practicing. And so you might ask yourself the question, well, we could believe some Dead Sea Scrolls. And I note that the Dead Sea Scrolls also, there is a single fragment upon which the Zadokim and the Zadok calendar proponents, that they rely on this one particular fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they don't know from which document that fragment is held. And because of that, it really cannot be taken as a serious reference, because we don't know from which book it was, given that maybe 60% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not scripture. So this could have been from, anything. So the long and the short of it is that there may be inferences and there may be coincidences that allow you to justify the idea of a 30-30-31 calendar as proposed in the book of Hanok and as reiterated in the book of Jubilees. But there's not hard evidence to that effect. And there is no evidence that the Mashiach followed that calendar. Rather, there's evidence that Mashiach followed the Barley calendar, and in particular, a Barley calendar that began with the last new moon before the vernal equinox and not after the vernal equinox. All right. Now that we've talked about that aspect of it, I want to kind of come back with this Barley calendar so that we understand what the Barley calendar is. The Barley calendar is a calendar that is a solely lunar calendar, and you could actually augment it with a solely lunar and astral calendar. That is to say, the stars also predict the signs, seasons, days, and years. And this is an instruction given in the Paradise Torah in Genesis 1:14 and 1:16, saying, the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars also are to be used for signs, seasons, days, and years. And when we talk about seasons, the seasons are going to be, the word there is moedot, which is talking about the appointed feasts, the appointed times. And so when are these appointed times? Well, if you look at the appointed times in the spring, on the 14th day of the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, so you can see the appointed time is in a particular month. And then when you look at the fall feast, on the first day of the 7th month, on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the 15th day of the 7th month, you can see there, again, you're talking about a month in terms of the appointed time or the appointed seasons. So because of this, there is a direct correlation between the moon and the seasons. But there is a direct correlation between the sun and the day because, of course, the sun rises and the sun sets. And in this discussion, again, one of the discussions about the Zadok calendar was that the day began when the sun arose. And yet we see that the instruction for Pesach is to kill the lamb at evening. So when you're going to, the Erev Pesach is when you're going to eat the lamb. So this gives you an indication that Pesach begins at evening when you're going to kill the lamb and eat the lamb, and it goes all the way through the night and all the way through the following day, which is to say that the day begins in darkness and finishes in light. This is totally consistent with the beginning of Genesis, where Genesis says, and Elohim created the heavens and the earth, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the deep. So darkness existed before verse 3, where Elohim said, let there be light, and there was light. Darkness existed first, light followed it. And so this is the pattern of the day. The day begins at sunset and continues through until the following sunset. And you can see that, again, Mashiach is on board with this principle because he tells them, go get the upper room that we might keep the Pesach. And they kept the Pesach that night. They kept the Pesach that evening. Erev Pesach is when they kept that meeting. And then he left and went out and prayed in the garden, was arrested, taken before the Sanhedrin, beaten, and so on and so forth. All that happened coming into the daylight the following day, which was still the same day. It was the day of preparation. Okay, so we've got an idea when the Gospels are telling us when the day begins, given the practice of Mashiach at Pesach. It's also telling us that it was a solar lunar calendar and that it began before, it was the dark moon before the vernal equinox. Now, if we understand that, where is the only scriptural reference we get, the direct reference that tells us the day of the month that we should start the monthly count? Well, that's in Psalm 81:3, right? Blow the shofar on the covered moon, the day of our appointed feast. Now, the word there, keseh, means covered, because only on 2 occasions does it mean appointed, and that's probably a Masoretic extension where the Masoretes determined that it was a different word when it was not a different word. The word there means covered, a covered moon, not a full moon, but a dark moon. And the feast that would begin on that would be Yom Teruah, which is the only feast that begins on day 1 of month 7, or the day 1 of a month. So blow the shofar on the first day, right, on the dark moon of our appointed feast. That would be Yom Teruah. That would be the first day of the month of Tishri, or Etanim. And this is when you would blow the trumpet, and it would be a dark moon. So in the Barley Calendar, there is one other way that we also calculate the barley. And this is, of course, Spica in the hand of Virgo. Now, Virgo is a constellation that sits at the event horizon. And in the winter, Virgo is in the southern hemisphere. And in the summer, Virgo is in the northern hemisphere. But you can tell the first month of spring, or the first month of the calendar, the biblical calendar, begins when the star Spica arises above the event horizon. And Spica is depicted as holding a barley sheaf in her hand. So this is why you can also use the arrival of Virgo above the event horizon as a marker that you have arrived at the month of Aviv, because the barley is in Aviv, because the barley is in her left hand and is now a wave offering above the event horizon. Okay, now in support of this idea of an astronomical view of the day using the sun and the moon and the stars also, there are at least 10 astronomical clocks that exist in Europe where they use the moon cycle, the sun cycle, and also the positioning of the planets to determine what month it is, what day it is, even what time it is. For instance, the clock in Wenceslas Square in Prague is just such as one of the astronomical clocks. So here you have people making clocks that they believe using the sun and the moon and the stars could accurately predict the number of days in a month, the number of days in a week, what month, what time, so on and so forth. All of this given in an astronomical clock. Well, that's quite interesting because you can see that it is proven that it is possible to use the sun, the moon, and the stars for exact, down to the second calculations in an astronomical clock. So was Yah lying when he said use the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars also for determination of signs, seasons, days, and years? No, he wasn't. All right. So you can see that when we verify these signs in the heavens, they can also be verified by the constellations in the heavens, if you know where they are. So let's cut to the quick. How do you understand the calendar? The last new moon before the vernal equinox is the first day of the year. The vernal equinox is somewhere between March 20th and March 21st, and the new moon must proceed that date to be the last new moon and the first day of the year. So it's behind the vernal equinox, which is necessarily going to place the full moon in front of the vernal equinox. The full moon is going to be a marker of the 15th day of the month, so you can expect to see matzah begin on a full moon, and you can expect to see tabernacles begin on a full moon. Okay, so then you simply clock the months by looking new moon to new moon, new moon to new moon, new moon to new moon. Now, a lot of people believe that the new moon is when it's first sighted, but it doesn't have to necessarily be seen by you, but it has to be the day that it would be sighted if there wasn't any cloud cover. And so when this happens, you have the new moon, and this is going to begin every month. So when you're looking, you don't need to have a calendar that says there's this many days or that many days or anything else. You look up in the sky and you see, is it a new moon or isn't it? Is it a quarter moon? Is it a half moon? Is it waxing? Is it waning? Where is it? And when you understand the moon signs, you can tell the day of the month, no problem, just by looking at the moon. Now, it's called a solely lunar calendar because the calendar is going to reset every year around the vernal equinox. So when you come up to that month, just before that new moon, that's going to be the last new moon before the equinox, well, that's the end of your calendar year. Now, that might be more than 12 months every now and then. And that 13th month is called an intercalary month. Well, that's ridiculous. You can't talk about a 13th month. There's no justification for a 13th month. Well, actually, there is. For instance, we know that with the 12 tribes of Israel, when Joseph presented his sons Manasseh and Ephraim in a Passover circumstance, to have his blessing pass over his head to his two sons, that created 13 tribes of Yasharel. Joseph was removed, Ephraim and Manasseh were added. That would put them at 13 tribes. When you look at the 12 disciples lost one, Judas Iscariot, and he was replaced by Matthias Barnabas. So there were 12. Again, once Matthias replaced Judas, there were 12 again. And then shows up Paul for 13. So you have 12 tribes of Israel, but sometimes 13. You have 12 apostles, but, sometimes 13. You have 12 months, but sometimes 13. And you can even see this when you look at the reconciliation that's talked about in Daniel 12. When he's talking about the 1,290 days and the 1,325 days, what is he talking about exactly? Well, he's talking about the fact that in his calendar, which was 12 30-day months, there would be a reconciliation every now and then that would have an additional 30 days. So a 13th month is what you get out of the 1290. And then the 1335 is an ultimate leap year that's required to reconcile all, because even with a 13th month, they would always be days short of a complete count. So this is the Barley calendar. This is how you understand it. You go moon to moon, new moon to new moon, new moon to new moon, until you come to the vernal equinox. Then start anew. And sometimes you get a 13th month. Okay? All right. Well, thank you for joining me on this discussion. I hope this is persuasive for you. All right. Bye. Oh, I forgot to say, thank you for joining me on Radio Free Alaska, broadcasting the voice of freedom in an unfree world. Oh, and by the way, I will not be broadcasting for the rest of the week because I'm going to be traveling, so I won't be able to make any more broadcasts until I get landed again, and then I can do some broadcasting. Okay, we will see you then.